Hello and welcome to part 2 of Edexcel's exam feedback training for A-level psychology based on the summer series of 2022. I'm Tim Lawrence, the psychology subject advisor, and this is the paper 2 section of our November live event, improved and re-recorded based on questions that were raised during the live event and additional feedback from our senior examiners. You can download the responses if you'd like to have a look at them in advance of this video that we're going to be looking at. See the links to the video below, and this follows on from the paper 1 video recording that we've shared previously, and paper 3 is coming soon. So aims and objectives, as for the paper 1 video, if you've seen that, we decided with this feedback training in response to the teacher's requests to focus on the extended response questions. And in general, we've been looking at stronger responses. We've chosen for this section to look at 3 different responses, giving a whole kind of range across the levels of the levels-based mark scheme to the same question, and to therefore give teachers who would like it a bit more practice at applying the mark scheme and deciding exactly which mark to give when you are giving your students feedback on their practice answers. So this has been written by our principal examiner for paper 2, Liz Calloway, and we're focusing on clinical psychology, question 6, a 20 marker. So a quick look at the examiner's report for paper 2 from last summer. Application was an area that remained difficult for candidates. So generic answers means that candidates were not thinking hard enough and were not succeeding in really connecting with the context. We mentioned in the paper 1 feedback that it's quite a common problem for students to just drop the name of the person in the context into their answer without doing enough to really explain how the theory and the psychology links to that context. Long answer questions remain difficult, candidates often lacking detail either in the AO1 knowledge and understanding or the development of arguments for the AO3 aspect of the question. So this question is therefore hopefully a useful one for us to be looking at. To what extent are classification systems reliable and a reliable and valid way of diagnosing mental disorders? So the context here, you'll see on a couple of slides time when we look at the first student response. If you've not already seen it, it's about a young woman potentially being diagnosed with schizophrenia. And one of the things that I'll explore on the next slide when we look in detail at the mark scheme for this is what the command phrase "to what extent" is really getting at. So the first thing I'd like to pick out about this mark scheme is the breakdown of assessment objectives. In a 20 mark question, there will always be 8 marks of AO1. So if it's a straightforward evaluate or assess question without context, then there will be 12 marks of AO3, and students need to understand that unlike the paper 1 12 marker, which is going to be 6 plus 6, for the 20 marker, they need to spend more time on the evaluation than they do on the knowledge and understanding. However, if it's one of these questions with context, then as the mark scheme goes on to stress, they should be giving equal emphasis to AO1 and AO3, and there's always 4 marks of AO2 on extended response questions, whether they're 20 markers or 12 markers or 8 markers. That's a good rule to share as well. Going on then, we have the lines of argument coming in again, and here supported by sustained application of relevant evidence. So that's what we're looking for in terms of the AO2 for the top band. Quite a common question we've been asked is the difference between to what extent assess and evaluate questions. And the response from our senior examiners has been, well, actually it's subtle, and the skills that are being assessed are basically the same between these questions. So I think it's important that students don't worry too much about the difference between them. The difference is evident though in the mark scheme, when we look at AO3 in detail here, these logical chains of reasoning and awareness of competing arguments are the same in all of those types of question, the evaluate, the assess, and the to what extent. But to what extent and assess questions then go on to talk about a balanced judgment or decision, whereas for evaluate questions, it's a balanced evaluation. And again, it's a subtle difference, but evaluate will be used where they really just need to show that they're aware of the arguments for and against, the strengths and the limitations. Something a little bit extra is being looked for in to what extent and assess questions, which is reaching a decision, although that needs to show awareness and give kind of a fair hearing to arguments on both sides, which is the balanced judgment. And for the level 5, which is only there on the 20 marker, there's this word nuanced, which will perhaps make a bit more sense when we've been through the first of our responses, but it's about kind of an awareness of some of the more subtle arguments and the some more difficult concepts to balance out. So on to our first response to this question. One of the questions we were asked during the live version of this training was whether it was an acceptable approach for a student to start their AO1 focused on the classificatory systems and describing how they worked. You might notice that this candidate has gone straight into defining reliability here and hasn't outlined or described the systems themselves first. Now, we've had clarification from our senior examiner on this one as well, and yes, they would receive AO1 credit for describing and outlining the systems. In general, any knowledge and understanding which is relevant to the question can be credited for AO1. However, this question is about reliability and validity of classificatory systems. So I think it's probably advisable to do as this candidate has done in terms of making sure that the question is addressed without spending too long on unnecessary AO1 detail, which is quite a common sort of pitfall. It's best to really focus on what the question is asking. So here they go straight into reliability and inter-rater reliability in particular. It's placed in context of ALBA. Another good question that was asked was sort of challenging how effective some of the AO2 links were in I believe it was this answer, because something we've stressed before is that it's not enough to simply drop the name of the person in the context into the question for strong AO2. And I think in some places in this answer, it does feel a bit like name dropping only. However, here there's definitely more than that, and so there's some decent AO2 there. We go on to retest reliability, and here we go. I think this one is perhaps a little bit more basic, this link here. And that's worth just bearing in mind when we come to deciding on the level, but there is again a link to ALBA there. So continuing with our first response, and we have some more AO1 content at the start of this page, moving on to validity. The question does ask about reliability and validity, so this candidate has addressed both strands there and gives the two different types of validity that are relevant here. Predictive, this is linked to ALBA in a fairly simple but accurate way. And then we move on to concurrent validity, and there's a little bit more detail in that AO2 content there. So all AO1 and AO2 so far, interleaved, which I think is a good approach in this question. And then we move on to some AO3 here. I think this is quite a useful phrase because the question has asked to what extent are the systems valid and reliable, and so yeah, here we have an argument that they are reliable to an extent, and that's quite a nice sort of phrase to use, helping the candidate to keep in mind that there's going to be competing arguments here. So some nice little linking phrases I've picked out here. This shows a high level of predictive validity as, and then an explanation of why. This is good because, so some elaboration kind of explaining the value there. However, so here we have a good example of a competing argument for why the validity is perhaps not that high. And this is linked back to ALBA, which is a good touch. So not only the AO1 in this answer, but also the evaluative points are linked, showing that there is that consistency. We then move on to look at another issue, or that of culture bias, which is relevant, and the application of that to ALBA is also made explicit. And having dealt with the evaluation of the validity of classificatory systems, this final page of our first response goes on to deal with the evaluation in terms of reliability. So it's an answer which is kind of very well constructed, good use of paragraphs and a clear structure which makes it easy to follow for the examiner. Here we introduce a study looking at test-retest reliability and comparing ICD-10 to ICD-9, which is relevant and a good piece of evidence to use. And this is then linked into a judgment about ALBA. Now, one of the questions that we discussed in the paper 1 feedback, which is available as a separate video, is that when we're looking for conclusions in evaluate questions, in assess and to what extent questions, they don't have to come at the end in a separate paragraph. What's important is that conclusions or judgments are being made throughout the answer. Is often the best approach. Obviously, they can be made in a separate paragraph at the end as well, but candidates should be it should be explained to them. They don't need to write that final paragraph repeating points they've already made. And this is a good example of one that does not do that, but it does contain judgments in each of these evaluation paragraphs. And this is a good example of one which shows awareness here with the word however of a competing argument. So that is an example of a balanced judgment. And then the final paragraph looks at inter-rater reliability in a similar way. Now, on to the mark scheme. So pause if you'd like to decide on the mark that you would give this if you haven't already. And I will now talk through the decisions of the examiners. So first of all, looking at the AO1, and that was considered to be accurate and comprehensive in this answer. So there is sufficient there to get into that top band, perhaps only just into that top band, but it is just about level 5 AO1. And the same can be said for the AO2. We do have sustained application. There are opportunities, I think, where there could have been more, but bearing in mind that there's only actually 4 marks available here, there were a lot of kind of thoughtful, sort of well-developed links to ALBA in there, albeit there are some that could have been developed further, but this is judged to be just level 5 AO2. The AO3 is judged to be level 4 here, so this is well developed. It's a logical argument. There's chains of reasoning evident. Definitely an awareness of competing arguments and definitely balanced judgments. But what we don't have is what's described in the level 5 descriptor as effective, nuanced and balanced judgment decisions. And really that's because this answer has perhaps come down a bit too much on the negative side when it comes to validity and reliability. It's true that there is a lot that you can criticize there. However, it's also the case that all over the world, psychiatrists are using these systems for a reason, and that is that despite their downsides in terms of reliability and validity, those are judged to be good enough that it benefits people that need help with mental health issues to use the systems, and perhaps this answer could have shown a bit more of a nuanced appreciation of that when reaching its decision. So on to the next slide, and we'll talk about the actual mark awarded. So here the overall decision was level 5. It's a best fit here. So although both the AO1 and AO2 were judged to be only just level 5, it was a kind of good solid level 4 AO3, and on balance just came over the line into the bottom of level 5 with 17 marks out of 20. We'll now have a look at our second response to this same question. Pause if you'd like to have a read of this. So this first page is all AO1. It has focused on validity and reliability and has linked both of these terms to diagnosis, which is good. We've got inter-rater reliability, concurrent validity, and predictive validity all outlined. And here is the rest of the response. So we start off here with some AO2, and there is a clear attempt to link the discussion of reliability and validity to Alba and her diagnosis in both of these short paragraphs. I'll say something about the success of those on the next slide. And then we move on to AO3 evaluation down here. Now, I just wanted to highlight this. So this is an example our examiner picked out of a judgment being made. So meeting the requirement in the mark scheme for those kind of mini conclusions which actually reach a judgment, not as well developed as in the previous answer, but that does count towards that requirement of the question. The very final part here is not creditworthy, doesn't really have anything to do with the question, but the rest is relevant evaluative content. Okay, I'll now talk through the decisions made by the examiners when they were marking this response. So pause if you'd like to make your own judgment first. Before I go further, I will just point out that a strength of this answer is that it did have quite a clear structure with the right kind of balance between the assessment objectives. The first reference to Alba was judged to be muddled. It didn't really make sense in terms of showing understanding and application of the concept of predictive validity, so that wasn't really creditworthy. But putting that aside, they do have a clear AO1 section at the start, which is relevant and focused on the question. They then have attempted at least to apply it to the context of the question, and then they've got some research evidence used to evaluate and to draw some judgment. So this isn't a bad answer by any means. It's clearly a lot less detailed and well developed than the first one, but the judgment of the examiners was this AO1 is accurate knowledge and understanding, so that gets into level 3 okay, particularly because that first part wasn't really relevant at all, and the second bit of AO2 didn't go much further. The AO2 was judged to be only at level 1, but remember that's only 4 out of the 20 marks available here, and then the evaluation was judged to just make it into level 3. So in terms of the overall level and mark, which will appear in a second, this was judged as we've previously explained to be level 3 in terms of AO1 and AO3, but only level 1 in terms of AO2. This is a best fit approach, however, and it was judged to just make it into level 3, and so it gets the bottom mark in that band, which is 9 out of 20. And here is our third and final response to this same question. It begins with this kind of short introductory statement, which isn't really creditworthy. It's basically just named the classificatory systems. So this candidate could have been advised to leave out that kind of introduction and go straight into their response. They then go on to give some AO1 detail just describing the ICD-10. And actually this is a creditworthy approach. It's fine for them to do this and they will get marks. Although the previous responses we've looked at went straight into the issues of reliability and validity, and they were better answers. I'll reveal that now. I think that's probably the best approach here. A question that was raised during our live training was, well, could you get AO1 credit in this question for describing the systems? And yes, you definitely could. We've got that confirmed for you. So this is valid AO1, as I said, and then the word however is a good little flagging term, so that's a helpful aspect of this answer. We then introduce AO3, which in this answer is the discussion of reliability. And actually, that's an important message, that there is no just one way to write a good 20-mark response. The candidate could have got a high mark by approaching their answer in this way. Going on, we have some linking here to ALBA, which is helpful, and like reasonable placing in context. The page ends a little bit less strongly though, because they introduce the question of concurrent validity, but without actually mentioning what that is. So that's a bit of a fail. Over to the second part of this response, and this is an interesting aspect of the marking here, because DSM-5 does not include 5 axes. The 5 axes are an important part of previous versions of the DSM, including DSM-4, but this is a mistake here, which this candidate was penalised for. And this led to a really good question being posed, because back in the paper 1 feedback, we looked at a strong response which made a mistake where the candidate meant to be writing about correlation coefficients, but they used the term concordance rate instead. Now, the judgment for that concordance rate correlation coefficient question was that they shouldn't be penalised for that, because the marking is generally positive. Examiners aren't looking for ways to knock marks off, and if they think that the candidate's understanding is sound, they've just made a slip, then they won't necessarily mark them down. In this case, a different judgment has been reached, that the candidate has not just made a slip here, they've quite clearly said that DSM 4 and 5 use axes, and they've shown a lack of understanding, given that they're relying on their knowledge of how the systems work for their AO1 content. They've made a significant error there, which is going to cost them. Moving on, we do here have some more evaluation, which is linked to ALBA, so there's some useful context there, but the judgment of the examiner is that when this cultural bias point is made here, it's really the same point, because they're still talking about subjectivity. So they've perhaps elaborated a bit there on their basic idea about the subjectivity problem, but they've not really added much by bringing in the idea of culture. So we'll now go on to have a look at the level-based mark scheme. And I'm just showing you the bottom 2 levels here. If you want to make your own judgment and you haven't already, pause now. So this was judged to not be mostly accurate knowledge and understanding, and this really is where that DSM-5 error has brought this mark down, because I think otherwise it would have made it into level 2 for AO1. As it is, that is judged to be at level 1. The AO2 is better. There are lines of argument occasionally supported. Relevant links to ALBA were made, not as good as in previous responses. This is a rather short response to a 20 marker, but that was the strength of this response, really. The AO3 was also judged to be down at level 1. A limited attempt to address the question. There just wasn't really enough focus on reliability and validity, and I think the approach of focusing on those and showing knowledge and understanding of them for the AO1 aspect of the response then is likely to lead to more effective AO3 evaluation, whereas this response was all quite basic in that respect. So we'll quickly go on to look on the next slide at the actual mark awarded. So that's a reminder of the level judgments for each assessment objective. Overall, this was put into level 1, but towards the top of level 1, I mean, it was a bit unlucky, arguably, to find itself in level 1 for AO1. The AO2 was better, so it gets 4 out of 20. Thank you for watching to the end of section 2. Section 3, on paper 3, looking at 3 different extended response questions to that, will be available very shortly, if not already. So do have a look at that. And the links on this slide are also in the description below if you would like to ask a particular question or sign up for newsletters if you haven't already. Thank you.